And thanks to NLADA for stepping in to do this. That was Radhika Singh, for those of you who don't know her, from NLADA. I'm Kathy Carr, and I just real quick, I'm the past executive director at Community Legal Services in Philadelphia, and I'm now doing consulting, including working with NLADA, particularly on their systemic advocacy initiative. We scheduled this webinar because Julia Simon Michel, who's going to be one of our panelists, if she can get onto WebEx. Julia asked me to help get some information on unemployment insurance issues out to the field early on in the pandemic, and we had a lot of interest in that and a lot of questions. And rather than having lots of people call Julia, we thought it was a signal that we needed to do something like this. We've got a lot of people who signed up for today, and welcome you all. I'm glad, especially in this incredibly difficult moment, that you're all with us. But I will say, I think that the issue of unemployment insurance for the legal aid community is an extremely important one. My program has had an employment unit for over 40 years, I believe, and both of our panelists from field programs come out of places where there has been long-term practice of employment law, including unemployment insurance. But that's not true around much of the country. And yet I think right now we're all recognizing that this is an extremely important source of income for low-income folks, and that it's something we need to learn about. And I'm hoping that this will lead to a wider and wider practice and more energy and information around unemployment insurance issues. So we put together, I think, a great 3-person panel for today, and I will introduce them. First of all, we're going to have, the first speaker is going to be George Wentworth, who you can see. He is senior counsel at the National Employment Law Project. NELP is an organization that has been extremely important to the field for many decades, both in terms of backing up field programs and in terms of doing great advocacy and information providing to the field. But real national advocacy around a range of employment issues. Second, we have Audrey Richardson, who is the acting managing attorney of the employment law unit at Greater Boston Legal Services. Greater Boston, like Community Legal Services, has done employment law in a sophisticated and really creative fashion for many years, and Audrey's been an important part of that work. We're going to have, the agenda is that George is going to start with giving us an overview of unemployment insurance and its kind of spin-offs and supplements in the pandemic era. And then we're going to have Audrey and Julia, assuming we get Julia on board here, each speak about their work specifically that's come out of the pandemic in terms of both assisting people with applications and providing more support in terms of representation, et cetera, for people who are trying to get on the various unemployment insurance programs. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to George. Thank you, George.
Thank you, Kathy. And thanks for inviting me to participate here. Legal Services has really been the primary voice for unemployed workers through all the recessions in our lifetime, and this one certainly presents the greatest of challenges. Let's go to our first slide. So, and I know most of you have worked in the area of unemployment insurance, so forgive me if I get a little bit elementary here, but just so that we're all on sort of the same square one. As y'all know, unemployment insurance is intended to replace roughly half of the wages that workers lose, but because of state programs that have some pretty low caps. It's actually much less than 50% in many states. 40% is probably where we are in the national average. Unemployment insurance, basically, to be eligible, you need to have lost your job involuntarily, generally through no fault of your own. You need to have a recent work history with wages. In most states, that's called a base period, and it's usually the first 4 of the last 5 completed quarters. So that means you file a claim today, we're probably going to look at the 4 quarters in calendar year 19. You typically need to be able to work, available for work, and making an active work search. But during this unique recession, Congress was smart enough to tie administrative funding to waiving certain requirements early on. And one of those was to waive work search, knowing that many unemployed workers would be basically social distancing or quarantining. Work search, 44 states have a waiting week. Most states have waived that. And importantly, experience rating, that is taxes being charged, tax rates being impacted by benefits. States are mostly waiving experience rating through calendar year 2020. States set their own formulas, and the range goes from shockingly low to in about a half a dozen states, the maximum rate is below $300, and it goes up as high as $795, mostly in northeastern and northwestern states that have the higher maximums. Most states provide 26 weeks. There are actually 10 states that cut the maximum number of weeks. 4 of them have restored 26 weeks since this through executive order, but there are 6 states that you see below that offer less than a maximum of 26 weeks. Next slide. So one of the first things that Congress did was to create a new program, Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, or PUA, which is intended to basically cover those workers who are not going to be covered by the traditional UI system. It's entirely federally funded, and it's offered for up to 39 weeks. The model is taken from a program known as Disaster Unemployment Assistance, which some of you have worked with in been hit by natural disasters. It does a couple things. First, it covers workers who are not traditionally covered by a state UI program. So that's a lot of self-employed and gig workers. It also means some people that work for religious institutions and so on may also be covered. But then there's like a much broader category, and sort of all those people who should be applying for state unemployment insurance but don't qualify for a variety of reasons. That can be they don't have enough wages, they are looking only for part-time work, or they're unemployed for, and there's a whole laundry list of sort of COVID-related reasons, a lot of which make you not available for work. If you've got a COVID-related health problem, you're caregiving for somebody who's got a COVID-related problem, you're home with your kids because school closed and you can't go to work. Those are some of the reasons that this program might cover you. It's tied to the state benefit levels. And one good thing about it is there's an actual minimum. So no matter how little wages you have, you're going to, under PUA, you're going to qualify for a minimum benefit, which is based on half of whatever your state's average UI benefit is. Next slide. So there's been, I'm sure you've all heard about this controversial Pandemic Unemployment Compensation, or PUC. This is a federally funded program that adds $600 to every UI payment that goes out. So that's regular unemployment insurance, an extension, or pandemic unemployment assistance. If you qualify for any amount as low as $1 and you're being paid for a week before July 31st, current federal law attaches $600 to each weekly benefit payment. And this is certainly ramped up interest in the program in places that might not normally see it. Next slide. There's also, and this has not really come into play yet, but there's also a 13-week extension for regular state unemployment insurance, completely federally funded. And once you get beyond that, state unemployment rates are now so high, many approaching or going over 20%, that there's also a traditional state extended benefits program triggering on in almost every state. And at least under the CARES legislation, that's all federally funded through the end of the year. Next slide. So what we want to, as Julia and Audrey talk about setting up programs to help workers file, I want to just sort of get a little bit behind the headlines in terms of what you're going to be facing out there, or what you're already facing, I'm sure, is that it is really, really difficult for people to apply for unemployment insurance. So what are some of the reasons for that? First, volume. Over 40 million unemployed have filed for UI in the past 10 weeks, and roughly a third of them have not yet received any benefits. The waits have been really long, and there's still many, it looks to like more millions in the queue, still waiting to file for benefits. System capacity, to give you some sense of how much this volume represents, the most that ever filed in a single week before this pandemic was about 700,000. And now, and for the last 10 weeks, it's been 2, 3, 4 million a week. So in most states, the work that they're facing represents what would normally be 2 years worth of work. And they've basically accumulated it in less than 3 months. Crumbling infrastructure, for those of you who deal with these programs, states have transitioned to online systems, but they're building on top of some very old software, legacy systems written in languages that you can't even get people to program anymore. So this has been a problem we've been commenting on for a long time. And part of the problem with going to online systems is they're effectively self-service. So whereas 10 years ago, you were more likely to call a call center and have somebody walk you through the questions and help you out where you stumbled. That's generally not happening now. There's the only way that you're getting to a staff person is when you're in trouble, and then you usually have to go trying to track down that person by phone. And getting through on the phone has been virtually impossible in most states. The states themselves are starting from a low point financially. Their staffing levels were tied to the unemployment rates, and the unemployment rates were at historic lows just a few months ago. So they started with very low staffing. Next slide. So what's going on is that the agencies are staffing up, but and they're quickly going from 0 to 100, and there's Congress basically relaxed the rules for the staffing. So you've got a lot of non-civil service staff involved. There's a lot of private contracting out to some call centers, and consequently, you're dealing with a high percentage of staff who are not well trained and are not able to give the kind of advice that people having problems typically need. A lot of these systems are very complex. They weren't designed with low-wage workers in mind, and they're set up to pretty much pause at every point in the process, often making it difficult to even complete the online transaction. A lot of these states are obsessed with fraud and have built a lot of identity verification mechanisms into their programs. This has resulted in a lot of issues around PINs and password resets. Sometimes claimants if their name or address cross matches with some other program like DMV, they might get kicked out of the system. A lot of reports of that kind of thing going on. These programs are supposed to be accessible to limited English profession claimants. Many are not. And we're just now digging out of the first wave of backlogs. And what that typically means is that the cases that have yet to be decided are the problem cases, the ones that have some unique eligibility issue that doesn't just move sort of automatically through the system. Next slide. So this Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program, PUA, is a kind of a different animal than what the states are typically used to administering. The good news is that all the states are paying it. Many of them took weeks and weeks to even get their first, to get to the point of accepting their first PUA application. What is an important thing to know here is that in order to get on PUA, the claimant needs to show that he or she is ineligible for regular state unemployment insurance. So the states have had different ways of dealing with that. Sometimes we'll make you go through the entire UI application process. Others have found a way to shortcut that a bit. But what is not clear is that in some states, after you're found ineligible for regular state benefits, workers are not always being automatically advised that they now need to apply for a PUA. There are some issues of first impression for UI adjudicators, and we're starting to see some inconsistent interpretations of PUA law between states. Because these are workers who typically don't have wages reported, or at least many of them don't have wages reported to the state, there is an attestation process that workers need to go through, which can be slow and cumbersome, particularly if you're working remotely and if the agency isn't taking your information by email. And then finally, if things weren't sort of difficult enough, in the last few weeks, there's been a reported major organized fraud scheme it started in Washington, but it's really spread around the country, where a criminal ring out of a Western African country, I believe, basically has secured all kinds of identities that it's using to file for benefits, and people who are fully employed are getting notices saying, thank you for your unemployment application. That is likely to create more obstacles for low-wage workers. I think that's my last slide. Oh yeah, and finally, once you've got workers who are are receiving unemployment insurance, we now are facing the issues of as economies reopen, employers are calling workers back, and many of them have justifiable fears and anxieties about risk of exposure to COVID in their workplaces, and are concerned whether their employers are taking all the proper health and safety measures. Just to plug here that every state unemployment insurance law has these suitable work provisions that take into account the degree of risk to health, and but these are going to be difficult issues, highly subjective to the individual's circumstances. Thanks. I'll hand it over to Audrey.
Let me just first thank you. That was George Wentworth from, I know people are joining us since we started, from the National Employment Law Project with an overview. And we're now moving into Audrey Richardson from Greater Boston Legal Services, who's going to talk about the work they're doing there. Thanks. Go take it, Audrey.
Hi. So I'll start with a little background on GBLS and our UI work. And can I just make sure that folks can hear me because my screen is freezing up a little bit. Is it good?
It's good to me, yeah.
Okay. Okay, great. So Julie and I will both talk about different efforts that we've implemented, our programs have implemented since the crisis started to help folks navigate and resolve problems in the UI claims process. There's some overlap in what we're doing. There's actually a lot of overlap. There's also some differences in how our programs have done things. So just two different models, and to some extent reflect some of the differences and circumstances or challenges that we have in our separate states. Also, to some extent reflects, I think, just some differences in the ways that our programs have done UI work prior to COVID. And some of it is, I think, probably just the randomness of folks scrambling to respond to the need and figure out something that works in the moment. So hopefully, I don't think there's a right or wrong answer about how to do this, but we'll give you these two models or two examples, more like, of how our programs did things. So GBLS has, we have had a well-established unemployment benefits practice area for many, many years. In terms of resources that we have brought to it in the past, we've typically had, I think, 3 staff, plus or minus in any particular moment, usually a paralegal and a couple of attorneys, with a mix depending on other responsibilities or if we've had fellows. And the work has been a mix of representing workers, claimants, in unemployment benefits appeals hearings, as well as quite extensive advocacy work over the years. So we were coming at it with extensive background and involvement in unemployment issues, but we had always had this filter on our intakes, that we didn't even actually get those intakes through our centralized intake process unless a claim had already been formally denied and either the claimant had appealed, or if the claimant had been approved and the employer had appealed, putting the benefits at risk. So we would take, as I said, take those cases, provide representation in the appeals hearing, sometimes go up to the appellate level within the agency or to court. And then also couple that, and actually informed by that, folks in my program did extensive class action litigation and systemic policy advocacy, again, both at the agency level and also legislative advocacy, both affirmative and defensive. So Massachusetts, we're proud to say, has one of the strongest UI laws in the country and the highest benefit rate. I just should also say that this is not something I personally take any credit for, and I'm a bit of an imposter here because I spent this past many years focusing on wage theft and immigrant worker center support and related issues, and just ended up changing and jumping into the UI practice area with the COVID crisis. You folks may know of Monica Hallis, who's been doing this work for 40 years, Brian Flynn, who's been doing it for more than a decade, Elizabeth Whiteway, who's been doing it for the past few years. Those folks really actually get the credit for the systemic work and policy work and the casework as informed by the casework that we've done over the years. So I'm just the spokesperson for this little snapshot in time. And one of the things that's also been a key part of our unemployment practice is the extent to which that it's involved community-based organizations, including in our wage theft work. We work a lot with immigrant worker centers and other grassroots groups. That work actually goes back quite a long time to include working with these groups and representing them as organizational clients in unemployment advocacy as well. A lot of this advocacy did focus on access issues and concerns that we had always had with language access, like George was talking about, and the problems that we were having then with the online claim system that was rolled out in 2013. Unfortunately, even though ours was not as old as many others, it is still a deeply flawed software platform. There's been all kinds of problems in the language access realm. It's English only until very, very recently. It's complicated, it's non-intuitive, it uses jargon, and it's also computer only, not accessible via smartphone or tablet. Our agency, the Department of Unemployment Assistance, did do a decent job of putting out multilingual materials. They have some good folks there, although we've actually had to sue them over putting out about meeting their obligations to provide multilingual notice. And there always was a workaround. The phone-based claim system and a pretty good customer service department, which had good people trying to do good work. So if you were limited English proficient, if you didn't have computer access, if you simply didn't have the comfort with or facility with technology and the jargon to be able to do your claim online, even with our flawed UI online system, you could call up the agency, and for the most part, somebody there who knew what they were doing would help you get your claim filed correctly. And so for the most part, the claims at the initial phases before those substantive denials, those denials on things like separation issues, like did you quit your job or were you fired and was it a disqualifying reason or not? For the most part, the parts of the process that came before that weren't a huge problem because there was this workaround. And then came COVID or COVID-19, and that everything broke down. So all of the problems that did exist in the UI online system just were off the charts magnified. And of course, the breakdown really hit those who had relied on that phone line workaround. And, you know, the LEP folks, the folks without a computer, the folks without tech facility, and who then just had, or others who had barriers to navigating that completely non-intuitive, non-user-friendly online claims form. So we actually right away in mid-March realized that this was a huge problem. We, because of the relationships with the community groups, we actually just knew immediately that people just weren't getting their claims filed at all and couldn't navigate this system. So our first thought was that we just simply had to provide support to help folks get their claims filed using the online platform, essentially to be a conduit for people to go through us and a project we would set up to get those actual online claims filed. There was this massive problem with resetting passwords, which meant that a huge number of workers who had at any point filed UI claims in the past online couldn't even get into the system at all. So that's what we got started with. Then we unfortunately very quickly realized that our problems extended beyond that initial claims process, actually not beyond the initial filing, into what we think of as the early claims process, really the mechanical and information gathering and basic documentation phase of the project that in the past simply had not been a problem. So for example, these are things like getting the basic monetary information, the list of employers and the amount of wages that have to be entered into the claim to establish monetary eligibility during the base period of the claim. So the way the UI online software in Massachusetts is set up, you have to provide the information, the right information, to your employer, and select the employer from a pop-up list so that the cross-match works with the Department of Revenue and the wages populate correctly. Again, in the past, this was not something that had been a problem, but so many folks were so desperate to just get their claims filed using the online system because they couldn't get through to DUA. And, you know, regardless of whether they were proficient in English, regardless of whether they could understand this incredibly complicated and jargon-filled form, regardless of whether they were trying to use it from a device that didn't really work with, they were desperate to get it filed. So they did. And these claims, a lot of these claims got in, but the information that was being input was just incomplete, wrong, just not doing the trick. So for example, on the monetary eligibility, huge numbers of people getting monetary eligibility determinations that said they didn't have any employment or any wages at all within the base period of the claim. So of course they were denied. So another example would be just that folks weren't able to figure out how to upload the basic documents needed to establish work authorization or to verify identity. They have to be uploaded in certain formats. It's inconsistent where you can upload them on the account. You don't always have an option to. Folks who are limited English proficient had to get notification by mail, and if you got notification by mail, you could not even have an option on the online account to upload. you have to send things in by snail mail, which of course was completely inappropriate to time of pandemic, having people go out of their houses to mail things, and then the Department of Unemployment Assistance mailroom being utterly overwhelmed with old-fashioned snail mail envelopes. And then there were just outright errors. People saying in their claims that they were seasonal or on-call workers, saying that they had pensions that they were getting when it's simply that they had some type of retirement account but weren't actually getting that now. People just erroneous information going in saying that their dependents they were claiming were not even in the country. And this was all just because the system is so bad and people were just really desperate to get stuff filed. So needless to say, all of these claims that had all these different kinds of errors, those are just a few examples, were just stuck, going nowhere. So what did we do at GBLS? So first what we did is we set up a program that would be to help with claims. And then in our case, given what we knew about the truly ridiculous and non-substantive nature of the mechanics and information gathering problems that were holding up claims, we extended that to providing follow-up support with those mechanics of the early claims process. So providing documents, providing the names of missing employers, providing a proof of missing wages, for example. Also helping workers set up the PIN numbers, which is the only way for limited English proficient workers to keep their claims going by certifying or requesting benefits by telephone each week. And so we have our volunteers, we'll explain a little bit more about that, are doing as much as they can from the outside of the system to get these things fixed. But unfortunately, it's actually quite limited. The way the system is structured, many issues can only be fixed from the inside. So our role, that of our volunteers working on this project, is to troubleshoot, identify the problems, gather the information, package it, and then provide it to our contacts within the agency so that they can make the fixes that need to be made from the other side of the computer screen. So we started this as a pilot project within GBLS and asked for volunteers from around the program. And this was in March when things were a little chaotic and very much in flux. Some people were swamped, some people were bored. Everybody was trying to figure out remote work. But we did have some folks within the program, especially students and interns, who suddenly had some time on their hands. We were also swamped with outside offers to help, which we were very appreciative of, but frankly couldn't manage right off the bat. So what we basically started with a pilot project, as I said, within GBLS, but then when we worked out some of the kinks, we expanded to some of the already organized law school programs that we had established relationships with at Eastern Law School and Harvard Legal Aid. Law school programs and pro bono law firms. Again, looking for ones that have pre-existing structures, pro bono coordinators, access to interpretation resources. While we've had lots of offers of individual assistance as well, those have been we've turned down most of those because it's just too cumbersome for us to manage. So just briefly on PUA, we also did incorporate PUA when the application was rolled out. Massachusetts was eager to be the first state in the country to roll out PUA, which unfortunately means that the application was rolled out in a rush and was deeply flawed with lots of very serious legal and mechanical and language access errors, only in English, only online, no phone option at all. And then there's obviously all sorts of questions about how PUA interplays with regular UI. And that's been a huge problem in Massachusetts and I'm sure other states as well. So to the extent that the issues in PUA tracked or mirrored the early claims issues in the UI system, we have incorporated that work into our project and assist workers with PUA claims and with resolving those early claims problems. And then as with UI, we've also used the information that we've gathered to do extensive advocacy with the agency and with the executive office for the very significantly needed legal and administrative changes to improve the system. So I'll just talk a little bit about the mechanics of our project. I'll just show here, we had a flyer created. Oops, sorry. I shared the wrong thing. Apologies. Let's see. Oh, wait, I see why. So here we just created this little flyer. This is just something we actually threw together really fast, but we just gave the basic information. This is when it was just UI online, and we both set up a couple of voicemail lines and also filled out created a short form, like a Google form, but it was a Microsoft form since that's what we used, that would automatically populate a spreadsheet that we then used as the basis for our volunteers and participants to be assigned workers to assist. So we had, like I said, we started within GBLS and then expanded outside and had training that we did. And we now have a helper agreement that covers things like confidentiality and stuff like that. And then we also created a whole set of instructions. I'm not going to go through them here at all, but I just want to give a sense of what we did. Sorry about this. So these are our pro bono partner instructions that we created that basically went through, frankly, all the kind of just mechanics of getting an interpreter, calling the worker, following up on the claim. Then it went through, DUA does have a pretty decent PowerPoint that goes through slides of the claim, UI online claim. So we use that as our foundation. We had other materials, both substantive and process-oriented materials, and a whole bunch of notes. And then the other thing that we did, since we were going into the early claims problems, is that we basically, I'll scroll down here, had addressed basically the most common issues that we were seeing that people needed to be addressed, that were really, again, these mechanical early claims problems that were just holding up people's claims. And so I'll just scroll through, we had to set up some security for using social security numbers. This is all just the content of the kind of process here, confirming work authorization, going over the information needed. And then what we did is we basically went ahead and set up, in terms of the problems, we had all these links to substantive materials, notes about some of the things that are a little bit tricky about the application. And then we had this set of problems, like I showed you before, but we had some instructions for each of these problems. And then I'll just give an example. We had an appendix, which had of course, the information that people need to have at the ready to file a claim. And then I'll just show the monetary eligibility one here. This is just kind of the basic information that we needed to be able to resolve these problems. Again, very much focusing on the mechanics and the information gathering. This is not high-level legal work. They're really just doing the very basic things that are needed to help people navigate this process. So that just gives a sense of what we did to try to help provide people with an approach for navigating this process. So at this point, we have expanded it. We basically, if at any point that the claims become more complicated, that they start to either require more legwork to figure out, have legal issues, have substantive separation issues, or other substantive eligibility issues, have denied on those substantive issues and need to go to appeals hearing rather than being corrected within the claims process. At that point, we do a full intake and they go to our normal UI practice group to be either kept in-house or referred out for representation at a hearing. And we've been working to expand our pro bono representation pool for that. There have been some challenges, admittedly. The whole piece of interpreters has been a challenge. We've gotten some volunteer interpreters, but especially as we've gone outside of GBLS, we've tried to get people to get interpreters themselves, and that has been challenging. Some of the firms we wish were more eager to just go ahead and get themselves signed up and pay for a language line, and that has been a little bit more of a struggle than we anticipated. The backlog has been, or just the flood has been overwhelming. We have had trouble keeping up. And it's been challenging making contact with workers. This is different than what Julia will describe, since they did a hotline model, but we were doing callbacks, and there is a lot of concern about scams and fraud, justifiably. And people, even though they may have called for help or asked the community group to refer them for help, they didn't necessarily feel totally comfortable passing over their social security number and UI online password to a person who randomly called them. So we've gotten various ways of trying to allow people to provide confirmation of who they are and how we got their name and number. And then one of the groups in the Boston's Chinatown Cantonese speaking community, there's been people have had really bad experiences with identity theft and fraud. So the Chinese Progressive Association, that's based in that community, started providing the workers who were coming with a confirmation number that they would then give to us, so that when our volunteer called them back, they would have that confirmation number to provide the worker, to give them assurance that we were the ones calling back off of the request that they had put in through the Chinese Progressive Association. And of course, now that there's a huge problem with PUA fraud, which has definitely hit Massachusetts, there's even more concern and heightened awareness of concern of the possibility of fraud or scams. So that piece has been a bit of a challenge as well. But that said, we've been in contact with close to 2,000 workers. We've resolved several hundred claims that had these early claims problems that were causing denials or very significant delays. And of course, those folks have just been incredibly, they've been very appreciative, of course, and it really has been clear that helping them through this process and giving them with the ability to helping them get the ability to get access to these benefits has made an incredible difference in their family's ability to weather this incredible crisis.
Great. Thank you, Audrey. Again, that was Audrey Richardson from Greater Boston Legal Services. And now we're going to turn it over to Julia Simon Michel, who indeed is present and can hear us too. So welcome, Julia.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathy, and thank you, Audrey. I also know there's going to be a bunch of questions, so I'm going to try to move things quickly along so that we can definitely get to your questions. So similarly, at Philadelphia Legal Assistance, which is a legal services corporation-funded organization, we have handled unemployment compensation issues since our founding in 1996, mostly through a public benefits unit until a few years ago, when we broke off into our very own unemployment compensation unit, and we currently function with a total of 4 staff for that unit. Typically, we accept all types of claimants who come through our intake, help from basic counsel and advice from general issues through appeals at hearings, written appeals to our Board of Review within our agency, as well as appellate litigation, which is our focus on impact litigation, as well as substantial systemic advocacy and policy work within the bounds of LSC regulations. One thing that I'll note is that based on a lot of that advocacy, we came into this with a very well-established relationship with our Department of Labor and Industry that helped us kind of stay up to date with like every single thing that was happening as the state began to implement a lot of different changes. So Audrey and George covered the need. I don't think I need to explain that. It's the same thing here in Pennsylvania. When this started, our online application was not mobile responsive, although they have now updated it and it is mobile responsive at this time. But we really wanted to start an application hotline almost immediately because we knew that there were people with technology barriers and language access barriers who would not be able to do the online application. So we set up a hotline system, and it's only to handle initial applications for regular unemployment compensation and reopens, which are very similar to filing an initial application. The way that works is it's open 4 hours a day, 5 days a week, and there are volunteers on it handling calls live. So I'm going to go ahead and I'll share the image that we circulated for our project. We also have this in Spanish and in Chinese that was going around. So the way we handled volunteers is we immediately went to one of our greatest partners, which is the University of Pennsylvania Law School, and asked for student volunteers there, as they have pro bono requirements, and a lot of pro bono work had shifted due to COVID-19. And we also reached out to several area corporate firms who we knew were interested in doing pro bono work. I'll preface this by saying that typically the Unemployment Compensation Unit does not partner with local firms, because we are always told that they cannot do unemployment compensation work because of positional conflicts, aka their labor and management employers will get angry if they do anything to help workers. However, we were told they were willing to waive that, given how the very limited scope of this, and that it was not actually any form of representation that they would be doing to help people file applications. And so all volunteers had to sign up through a Google form, and that gave us the opportunity to accept or deny them as volunteers, which was helpful because we did have a whole bunch of people who got the link through various bar associations and other things like that. And we wanted to keep it limited to the folks that we knew and had specifically recruited, again, because of the confidential nature of the information that was going to be shared. Our program also was prepared to start off with a Philadelphia-based hotline, but knew very quickly that we were going to expand across the state. So we made sure we had substantial volunteers to be able to staff that. We actually had initially 100 folks, 100 students from Penn respond, and over 50 volunteers from the firms. And so we are operating a statewide project. Anyone from across the state of Pennsylvania, or even from the rest of the Mid-Atlantic areas that needs to file a Pennsylvania application has access to our hotline. Once volunteers are accepted, they sign up for a specific shift on the hotline. For us, we only required 2-hour shifts. And then they were given access to an individual portal that allowed them to go live on the hotline. So when it was their turn on the shift, they go live on the hotline and they can receive incoming calls. The technology for that routed calls to whoever was seen as available on that portal system. All of the volunteers went through training. We created a video and lots of materials for them to review. And they were also provided with real step-by-step instructions on how to navigate the application, how to handle a lot of those legalese issues that folks have when trying to file for unemployment. So I'll go ahead and just show you the how-to guide that is just general. So the how-to guide, oh, I don't think that worked. There we go. So this is just a general overview, but it allows you to see, we took some screenshots. We mostly created this for you guys at this point. We took some screenshots of what the backend system looks like. So you can see that they're given suggested scripts for how to handle a lot of the basic information at the beginning. We also have a Google form integrated into this backend system where we collect information, including the very first information we ask is about language. So if somebody needs a language other than English, they are immediately scheduled for a callback. We had volunteers that covered 14 different languages who could do callbacks. And then if we had a language that was not covered or one of them was not available for callbacks, we would use language line. So they would get scheduled for a callback, and that callback would have to happen within 48 hours. And they'd be told there would be a callback and to expect a call from a number they might not recognize. There were some issues with some folks who did not have the language capacity to even give their name and phone number. And a lot of times they were coming from organizations we already had relationships with in the community. And so then we would just get an email from the organization that says, hey, I have this person, can you schedule them for a callback? So we did operate a little bit outside the system for folks who really struggled with language access. If they were able to move forward with the application with the caller, Then they would collect basic information that went out into a Google spreadsheet for us to follow. And then they would go ahead and fill out the application with the person over the phone. There's a step-by-step explanation of the application that our department put out that's very helpful. And then again, we created our own instructions. At the end, our volunteers are instructed to print the confirmation page and the entire application, which you're able to do as a PDF, and upload that into our system. So at the end of the call, when it's over, the system automates an email, if we have an email address, to the caller that attaches the that A, lays out what the representation or the relationship was between the hotline and the caller, gives other resources, and attaches the confirmation page and the application. If we don't have an email address or somebody is not comfortable navigating email, then we also are working with one of these mail systems where our system can send it to somewhere else, and then another system, I think it's in Texas, sends mail out for us, again, given the constraints that we're under with our office and COVID-19. So that's the basic kind of walkthrough of the application project. One thing to note is that as I said, our project only handles initial applications. We have not expanded to PUA applications because there have been a lot of problems with the PUA application in our state that we're working on from an advocacy perspective. But because it's constantly changing and it often makes no sense, we did not feel comfortable training volunteers to be able to help people navigate that successfully. I struggled to help people navigate that successfully as an attorney who's familiar with that system. And so we are waiting for things to settle down, and then we're going to be doing a huge public push to get people onto PUA once the system is better set up. And then we're planning to expand to do that. For people who had claim issues, who had other problems that are not initial application, we had two ways of handling that. If they just had general questions, which a lot of people did because they can't get through to the agency, then we were able to help our volunteers answer basic questions and provide information about unemployment. We were able to do that because we have a chat system where they can chat with the coordinator of the project and ask questions. And we also have a comprehensive frequently asked questions document that's over 50 pages long that I put together for advocates across the state, community groups, legislatures. I think at any given time, over 30 people are logged in looking at it. I can show that to you here. And so you can get a general idea of kind of like what it covers as I scroll down, all the questions. And you can see we have, I think, 30 people on it right now. And so all of our volunteers could get a lot of basic information from that and answer those questions. If they actually had a claim issue, at first they were getting marked for callbacks, which was a completely not unworkable system for us and our resources. And so what we switched to do is that we have an administrative assistant who goes through the Google spreadsheet, and our coordinator has highlighted folks who called in with issues that were not application related, and they get a text message, gets set up as a pre-screen in our legal server. And the text message, if they're non-Philadelphia, directs them to how to find their legal aid provider in their area. And if they are in Philadelphia, the text message gives them our intake information. And so we've been channeling everyone who has actual claim issues through our intake. Of course, our intake has exploded, but we have a fantastic intake staff that's able to handle a decent amount of those themselves. And my unit has been working nonstop. So all of those folks become actual clients, whereas the application hotline, they are not clients. We do not do eligibility checks. We do not do conflict checks. It's, again, limited scope service. But if they actually have an issue with their claim or a problem with their application after it's filed, they come through intake. We've also started now, we've put a lot of the kind of FAQ and information and built out our website. So now people are also getting a follow-up text message that directs them to the resources on the website. Because again, a lot of the questions, especially people are calling in about PUA, have to do with glitches we're seeing in the system, and there's no answer for them. But explaining that it's just not them, right? It's everyone who's having this issue, and the state is working on fixing it, really addresses a lot of their immediate concerns, not the concerns of getting money in their pocket. And so that's really helped us kind of channel people in the appropriate directions to get the help that they need. I'm going to quickly touch on two other things. So I mentioned the FAQ. That's been a huge help to people across the entire state of Pennsylvania. Like I said, I think it's our most used resource. It is not client facing. It is provider and legal aid facing. So this is not to send to clients, but pretty much everyone in the state, again, also our state legislatures are using this as their manual for unemployment as they are advising folks. We also have a complaint system that we set up several years ago online for people to file complaints about the agency and their inability to get through. And so that's also really seen a lot of action over the last couple of months, and we're able to again use that to send people follow-up text messages to direct them to the appropriate intake for cases. And it also helps us from a media and advocacy perspective because we also have stories from across the state. And then finally, we launched a similar data collection tool for people to report their problems with the PUA application, which really helped us identify what a lot of the barriers were very early on in the process, and informed the advocacy that we've done with the department about the changes they need to make to that program and to that application. And then the last thing I'll mention is, I said, we've been doing unemployment work exclusively in this unit for many years. And a large part of that is that we also supervise a law student project called the Employment Advocacy Project, which is at the 3 area law schools, where law students during the school year are trained and take on their own unemployment compensation hearings and appeals, because I think, as many as you know, for most states, you don't have to be a licensed attorney in order to represent someone in an unemployment compensation hearing. And that's been an incredibly successful project. It helped us also get a lot of law student volunteers for the summer, where we knew we were going to need people given the crisis. And I imagine it's going to continue into the fall. And so I highly recommend, to the extent you do not have staffing resources to handle hearings, when hearings start to really ramp up, that you look to law students. Local law students, they don't even have to be, at least here, admitted to any sort of like under practice rules or anything like that. We have 1Ls that I trained to do these cases. I did cases as a 1L. So I really recommend looking at law student resources, and I'm happy to also share any sort of information we have about that project, how it's run, how it's handled administratively. But it is a huge boon to us, and also I think really helps law students understand the barriers facing low-wage workers when it comes to these benefits, and I think it has long-term effects on their practice as attorneys. So with that, I'll go ahead and close out, and I know we have lots of questions.
Thank you so much, Julia. Well, I hope we have lots of questions, I apologize that I didn't say at the beginning that we wanted everybody to hold questions to the end, but now I welcome questions from anybody for any of the 3 panelists.
So Kathy, we do have some questions that have come in already, and I know people will be posting additional questions. Go ahead and do that in the Q&A box. We have a good, I think, variety of questions, some that are PUA specific, some that have to do with relationships with the with the agencies, and some that have to do specifically with the application. So let's start with some of these PUA general questions. I think the first one that came in really when you were speaking, George, is does the $600 cease on July 31st, or does eligibility to receive it cease on July 31st? How does that impact all of, when we're talking about the backlog of applications, if people received, were late in receiving a determination of eligibility, how does that limitation affect them?
So the July 31st expiration is basically covers any payments for weeks that end before July 31st. So even if there's retroactive payments being made in August or later, as long as the payments relate to those weeks, then and this is PUC, there will be $600 attached to any of those payments. I should say now that this is perhaps the most controversial of all the CARES legislation pieces. The Republicans kind of united in opposing it before it was enacted in an amendment. But there is now, there are certainly claims that it is a disincentive for some workers to return to work. There's likely to be some kind of political showdown over it. We don't know what will come out of that. It could be a smaller amount, or it could be an extension of the 600, or it could be something in between.
George, does the $600 show up in the same check as the state funds?
It can. I think in most instances it's being sent out separately. I mean, because basically it's pretty easy for the states to program. They just they take a file of all the unemployment payments they make at the end of the day, and then just take that same file and push out $600 payments attached to each of them. So it can come attached, but I think in more commonly it's coming as a separate payment. And keep in mind, and those of you who practice in this area know that you know, actual checks are the least frequent way of payments being distributed. Direct deposits is the most common. Debit cards are behind, you know, right behind that, and then actual checks. I mean, although there are some states that are still where checks are dominant, but yeah, they are generally coming out separately.
Radhika, does everybody see all the questions, or should we just mention?
Yeah, you and I should just ask them because they come, some people see them and some people don't.
So one of the big questions is about the materials and whether the materials will be circulated, and those are going to be on the NLADA website, right, Radhika?
That's right.
So you will be able to find all of these. There are a couple of sort of detailed questions about doing this, and there goes Radhika's cat across the screen. So we all need to smile today. So, okay. One of them is when the applicants answered a question for Julia and Audrey, when the applicants answered a question wrong because they didn't know the correct COVID-related answer to give, were your volunteers able to help them correct the applications, or did they need to challenge the denial at a hearing? How did that work?
So I'll go first. So here in Pennsylvania, and I believe in every state, once an application is submitted, you cannot go back in and edit it. It's part of the IRS rules that govern the part of the UI work, and George may know that better than I. So once you've made a mistake, you've made a mistake. And so it's an issue of either getting the agency to fix it, or then, yes, fixing it through an appeal. If we know that someone's made a mistake, that's when we would reach out to the agency to fix it if they're a client. If they're not a client, then there's also a chat system here in Pennsylvania with the agency, and an email address that people contact. And so people are, you know, things are slow, but people are getting responses from both of those systems to fix a lot of those types of problems. We also see that with issues on weekly or bi-weekly certifications in Pennsylvania. There are confusing questions that people constantly get wrong. And we're in the process of making an LEP guide to those questions, because we know that they confuse people, and as a result, when wrong answers happen, they cut people off from benefits.
On the LEP issue, Claudia Johnson asks if any states have been sued for the lack of LEP notice. There are probably a variety of litigation questions. Can you tell us, just sort of generally, has there been litigation yet? Is there likely to be litigation? What's going on that front?
George might be able to speak more nationally. I can tell you that groups here in Pennsylvania have sent a demand letter to Counsel for the Department of Labor and Industry and the governor's office on this issue. Actually, from a strategic perspective, we decided not to join that demand letter, given the other issues we were navigating with the agency. We thought it was helpful that other organizations push that issue, so that we could have kind of a multi-pronged approach to the advocacy.
And that sort of brings us to the question of maybe we should let George address. Well, Georgia, why don't you talk about the litigation first?
Yeah, I don't have a lot to add with sort of current legislation or litigation since the pandemic. There certainly are where the litigation has been in the last 10 years has been as states have quote modernized their systems and gone to online only or online primary. There have been places where language capacity was diminished. So I know that certainly there was a successful complaint in Florida back around 2014. There's some pending in with the U.S. Civil Rights Center from New Mexico and also from North Carolina, but I'm not aware of any sort of 2020 litigation yet.
Yeah, GBLS has definitely litigated in the past over language access issues. And I think in this particular moment, we've been focused. There's been such a range of issues that have presented barriers across the board that have in many cases fallen more harshly on limited English proficient folks, and then some that have fallen obviously very specifically on folks without language proficiency or English proficiency. But there's been so many things that have been needed to be fixed that we've felt that it was really important to be working with the agency to get things fixed as quickly as possible by without litigating for now.
Great. And both Julia and Audrey have talked about relationships with your departments of labor or whatever they happen to be called in each state. What can you give people who are new to this area of work some suggestions about how to start making contact, building relationships? I know that those relationships are extremely important at this point. If you can talk to people rather and talk about these problems, what suggestions or history do you have about that?
GBLS has a very long-standing relationship with the agency, so we were able to, when we were starting this project, we were talking to them about it and telling them that we were going to do this, and specifically asked for a contact who would be dedicated to us and would have the power to make the fixes behind the scenes, as if directly from the agency side of things. So that initial step was based on something that we could just go to them and ask for. And since we were basically helping them out and helping them do their jobs, we felt like that was a win-win for everybody. And they were willing to do that as well. So one of the things that we also did once our pilot project was off the ground is that we also did trainings for other legal services programs around the state in Massachusetts. And most of those programs are now starting their own efforts along these lines. And since they weren't necessarily, they didn't necessarily have as fully established programs in unemployment benefits. They may have had fewer staff or have done some stuff, but not to the extent that GBLS had, or may have, or not necessarily been involved in more systemic advocacy and didn't have those same contacts. And so we very much encouraged them to go through their legislators in their areas to have the legislators make the ask for them to be provided with their own contacts similar to what GBLS had. And we thought that it was important to be not only coming from them directly and making both the agency and the legislators aware of the scope and extent of the problems and statewide nature of them. And and then also, basically highlighting the extent of the problems that actually for legislators that their constituents were having as well, and getting them somewhat invested in helping to support an effort to resolve those problems and obviously, of course, to recognize the services that the legal aid programs are providing to their constituents, which hopefully will also help with our annual effort that is part of our annual effort to get legislative funding for legal services in Massachusetts.
You can talk about the LSC piece of that too.
Yeah. I'll simply add, we had a longstanding relationship with the agency, and that's in large part because our sister organization, Community Legal Services, had been doing policy work and advocacy with the state and the Department of Labor and Industry for decades. And when I came on at Philadelphia Legal Assistance in 2014, someone many of you probably know very well, Sharon Dietrich from Community Legal Services, helped transition a lot of the relationships she had at the department over to me. And there's been leadership changes since then, and I've maintained those. I also work very closely with the department because I'm on an advisory committee overseeing our benefit modernization project that's currently underway here in the state. And so I think we've proved our usefulness and how much we can help them on many different levels, including testifying before the legislature when different issues have popped up in a way that has often helped the department. And so, I'm in touch with the both the kind of policy director, the service center director, and of course the secretary, the deputy secretary for UI himself. But separate from that, we have a customer service contact that we were given as legal services back in 2012 when we first started having telephone issues here in Pennsylvania, which have been longstanding problems for access. And so legal services advocates across the state have a contact within the agency they can all go to kind of fix problems. Of course, that contact has had to have like 10 mini contacts attached to him, given the number of issues that we're currently having. If you don't have those relationships, I have a few suggestions. One, if you have relationships with state legislators or local city officials who can get you in the front door and connect you and explain what your role is and why you need to be working with the agency, I would go there. Two, make a lot of noise in the media. If you're making a lot of noise in the media as an agitator for these issues, oftentimes the agency will reach out to you themselves because they want to quell some of that agitation. And also there's the, going through the governor's office or other means of contacting to try to establish your role as legal services to the extent that you have any sort of statewide legal services project. Going to them from that perspective, I think can often be very helpful. Again, we represent many of the workers who are navigating these systems. And I think we provide more help than harm to them most of the time, but we still provide harm when we need to.
I think the state legislators are certainly being bombarded with questions and complaints about this, right? Probably in every single state because it's so difficult. So they're hearing about this, they're trying to learn about this, and I think going through them, and I'm not the LSC restrictions expert, but I think going to legislators to work on particular problems like this when you're not advocating for a change in the law is allowed, right, Julia?
Yeah, in that situation, if you went and introduced yourself as to who you were, or you already had a relationship and you just said, we're looking for a contact with the agency, there's no LSC problems with that. And we can do a lot of work within, administrative advocacy as long as it's dealing with issues that our clients are having and explaining how that needs to affect the way in which the system is implemented and works, not things like asking for funding or asking for a change in the law.
We did have one little confusion when we were advising other legal services programs in Massachusetts to go through their legislators, which is that some of the legislators have their own special contacts, at least in Massachusetts. They can get fast results, or maybe not, actually. They were having a lot of frustrations too, which was actually helpful that they understood. But they also, they weren't necessarily going to give the legal services programs their contacts, and that wasn't necessarily appropriate. So there had to be some clarification that the legal services programs were basically asking the legislators to help them get a contact who is going to work with legal services directly, rather than trying to just kind of elbow in on the legislators' own special deals.
Yeah. And they actually usually go to a legislative affairs office within the department that answers their question. So ours goes through customer service. So it's a different avenue. But yes, it's important to make clear that you're not asking for their contact because it's a different channel.
We have a question about signing applications. Do they have to be signed in old-fashioned signatures, or how do you deal with that?
In Pennsylvania, you don't have to sign an application. There's also no like username and password that you set up for regular UC. There is a certification box that you have to check, right? And so our people read out loud all of the certification information, just like they would do if it was UC on the phone taking the application. And one of the things that you have to read, the UC handbook. And so one of the other things we've been doing, if somebody doesn't have access to the UC handbook on their phone or can't get it, we've also been sending a PDF of that because when you file an application online, they don't send you the handbook by mail. They only send it if you file over the phone, but which these people are doing through us, but the system is seeing them as online applications. So it's just a certification, and we make sure that they, give us in essence informed consent that they're willing to certify to all that information.
Someone just asked if there are any statute of limitations or are there deadlines on filing for these things, these benefits?
So it depends somewhat, I think, on state law. I'll speak first to regular unemployment and then I'll speak to pandemic unemployment assistance. So for regular unemployment, your application is valid as of the day you apply, not based on the day you lost work. So if you lost your work in March 16th and you're applying on May 16th, your application is only valid and you're only eligible for May 16th going forward, or actually usually most of them backdate to the Sunday before. However, because there have been so many difficulties with people getting through to the system or calling unemployment, at least here in Pennsylvania, the agency has been much more lenient with their ability to backdate applications. So it's really important to request backdating. If somebody was not able to get through and file earlier, the agency can often take that into consideration and move the application date. For pandemic, I will say, and again, anything filed within a week backdates to the Sunday. So for instance, if somebody called us on Monday and needed a callback, as long as we can get through to them and actually connect by Saturday, right, or by Friday of the week, that application has no difference in eligibility dates or when they could get benefits if it was filed on Friday as opposed to Monday. For pandemic unemployment assistance, it is a retroactive benefit. It's retroactive it should be to the date you put as your last day of work in the application. And so if you file for PUA on June 1st and you lost your job on March 16th, you should be able to backdate claims going to March 16th. So that's one of the nice things about PUA, and one of the saving graces of a lot of the problems the program has had is that people are not going to lose access to benefits if they can't get their application in yet because of the retroactive nature. It goes all the way back to January 27th, 2020. So it really depends on when people in your state started being affected by COVID-19 in terms of their loss of work.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I would just also add, I mean, this has actually been one of our huge frustrations in the regular UI is that predates need to be individually requested, and you cannot do it through the online system. You have to make contact with the UA either by phone, or we do it through our contact to request that predate. And so this is one of the, in my mind, the stupidities of the process, which is that for all those folks, for all those claims that in March and April, where it was clear that there was a significant lag time between the last day of work and the date the claim actually got filed, that was because people couldn't get through. And we've begged for them to automatically predate those claims. So because the fact that everybody has to contact the UA individually to request those predates is just increasing. It's one of the many things that's exponentially increasing pressure on the system and calls that the agency then has to deal with, and that's then taking away the staff resources from things like actually processing claims. So it's really rather absurd, and one of the many frustrations that we've had. So
we're going to wrap up, but I want I to kind of ask a big question, and any of you can answer it, which is sort of reflecting some of the questions here. There's going to be a barrage of hearings probably because there's a barrage of applications. This is going to be a lot of work. A sort of basic question from somebody is, and from an LSC organization too, but so is this employment law and this UI law part of the basic legal aid assistance that should be provided? How come your organizations are doing this? Is this a priority? Should it be a priority? Tell something to all those people where the programs have done very little or next to nothing of this. Why does this matter? Should it be part of legal aid? Are there any issues around legal aid doing this? Why aren't all the programs across the country do this? Give everybody, each of you, if you want, or whoever wants to give a minute or two quickly. Julia, you want to start?
Sure. I'll say from an LSC perspective, unemployment is like the perfect LSC practice area because everyone coming pretty much for unemployment assistance tends to be LSC eligible. They've lost their job, they have no income, and they are all documented because you can only get unemployment if you are documented. And so when there was a split when CLS split off back when the restrictions were put in place and PLA was created, that was one of the reasons why the unemployment practice went to PLA. So we've had a very active unemployment practice since the beginning. I came in as a Skadden Fellow back in 2014, focused on unemployment, and I was actually the first active attorney we had in the unit in some time. So we've really grown it since then. It's definitely a priority for the organization. We've managed to bring in some funding over the last few years. And I'll note that for a lot of organizations on the call, if you're LSC funded, the funding that came from one of the recent stimulus bills that was LSC additional funding was provided with the idea that it was going to provide support for activities that were focused around COVID-19, and unemployment is a great way to spend down that money because we are clearly a COVID-19 issue. And so I know we're going to be able to staff up a little bit more with some of that funding, and hopefully other organizations across the country can. But I will say that since I've come on board, it's become clear to me that some of the heyday of like unemployment work at legal services that I think existed in like the 70s and 80s has really seen a decline in large part because of LSC restrictions. And it's not necessarily as high priority of a practice area in a lot of programs across the country. But I'm happy for more people to join on. I wish I could say that I will help you all set up your practice areas, but my executive director and Kathy will kill me because they know I don't have the time to do that. But it is my hope that one of the things that will come out of this is more kind of high quality UI practices in legal services across the country.
And like I said earlier on, I'm a bit of an imposter here, given that I actually, I've done unemployment work in the past, but had not been doing a lot of it recently. And my colleagues who, a couple of whom have lived and breathed unemployment casework and systemic and policy work for decades, and have always felt very passionately about it, say that this is the silver lining of the whole COVID crisis, which is that now everybody knows how important it is. Just obviously in terms of just what an incredible lifeline it is for folks, and how awful it is when the system breaks down, and how hurtful that is to the people who are looking to access that lifeline. So my colleagues are very, obviously there's a lot to be not happy about, but they're happy that to some extent people are really seeing that in this moment of crisis, but that it's not something that's going to go away, and hopefully we'll carry on from here.
I just want to add one more thing for those who are looking at funding opportunities, and I know everyone's focused on outcomes these days. Unemployment is one of the easiest ways to show a financial impact on your community. In 2019, our unit secured over $2 million worth of benefits for our clients. And so by tracking our outcomes and the weekly benefit rate associated with claims, and that's just in cases where we did full representation, right? Not even like looking at advice and counsel. And so you're able to really throw around some numbers to funders, to cities, when you're looking for support in UI practices. So I highly recommend thinking about how you want to track those outcomes to try to sustain these practices.
George, do you have any last words?
Sure. I just want to add a little real life perspective here. However marginalized UI might be in legal services practices, we're in a world now in which right now somewhere between 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 American workers is unemployed. And we're going to see the unemployment rate come out on Friday, and it's likely to be around 20%. And the road to recovery is not going to be quick. And you're going to see unemployment insurance being a major source of income for a major segment of Americans well deep into 2021. There will be more extensions. There will be problems that are not getting solved. And I realize you deal with a lot of different restrictions, but for many workers, this is going to be their primary means of subsistence through some dark times, and it ought to be elevated as a major part of your legal services practices.
So Radek and I have talked about how, and the panel, that this really, I think, needs to be a beginning conversation. I think, unfortunately, this may be the heyday now, or the return heyday of unemployment insurance as a real need across the country. So I think we as a community, and those of you who are doing this kind of work, let's think about what kind of support can be provided nationally, how NLADA and others can help provide that. I work also with MIE, and if we'll try to get some articles, maybe if anybody wants to write an article about your UI practice, get in touch with me. We need to help each other build this. So thank you for joining in today, and again, thanks to Radhika and NLADA for putting this on. Guess that's it, huh?
That is it. Thank you, everybody. So I posted in the chat. I know we may have had some questions we didn't get to. I did copy them, and I will pass them all along to our presenters in the event they're able to follow up with everybody. And just to remind everyone, we did record today's presentation, and we'll have the recording and the materials available to all of you on our website. So thank you again. Thank you to Kathy and Audrey and George and Julia for sharing your expertise and for pulling this together. And I suppose we just say, try to be well, everybody.